The rain fell sideways against the windows of the American embassy in Berlin, streaking the glass like claw marks. November 1938. The city smelled of wet stone, coal smoke, and fear that no one spoke aloud. Inside a narrow office on the second floor, Thomas Callahan loosened his tie and stared at a map of Europe pinned to the wall, its borders still drawn as if they meant something permanent. Callahan wasn't a soldier, not yet. He was a junior attaché from Boston, 32 years old, sent overseas to observe, listen, and write reports no one in Washington wanted to read. His job was diplomacy. His curse was timing. Across the street, torchlight reflected off helmets as a column of German troops marched past. Boots striking pavement in perfect unison, the sound seeped through the walls, steady as a heartbeat. Callahan watched them disappear into the mist and thought of something his father had told him after the last war. Men don't march like that unless someone's planning to spill blood. Behind him, the radio crackled softly. A German announcer's voice rose and fell with theatrical certainty, praising unity, destiny, grievance. Callahan didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. Everyone did by now. He turned back to his desk and picked up the cable he'd been drafting all night. Washington would receive it in the morning. They always did. And they always replied with the same polite caution. Observe. Do not provoke. Avoid conclusions. Outside, Germany was making nothing but conclusions. 3,000 miles west, in a narrow row house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Anna Kowalski folded laundry while the radio hummed on the kitchen counter. She was 27, first-generation American, her parents still speaking Polish at home when they were alive. Europe was never far from her heart, no matter how hard she tried to keep it there. The announcer's voice shifted tone, urgent now. Words like annexation, treaty. Munich drifted through the room. Anna paused, holding a small white shirt, her brother Michael's. He'd left it behind when he joined the Army National Guard the previous spring, more out of pride than fear. They'll sort it out, her neighbor had said yesterday. That Hitler fella just wants his seat at the table. Anna wasn't so sure. She switched off the radio and pressed the shirt to her chest, feeling the ache settle in her ribs. Somewhere across the ocean, men in suits were shaking hands and drawing lines on maps, telling themselves it was all to keep the peace. Somewhere else, soldiers were already cleaning their rifles. In Berlin, Callahan finally sat, pen hovering above the paper. His report read like a warning wrapped in diplomacy. The Reich's recent agreements appear conciliatory on the surface, yet each concession strengthens their position militarily and politically. This pattern suggests preparation, not appeasement. He hesitated, then added another line. Failure to recognize the strategic intent behind these maneuvers may result in consequences beyond Europe. He signed his name and exhaled. It felt like shouting into a storm. Later that evening, he attended a reception at the French embassy. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter bounced off gilded walls. Diplomats spoke of compromise, of buying time, of avoiding another catastrophe like 1918. Callahan listened, nodding, watching the way German officials smiled without warmth. A colonel he recognized from the Wehrmacht leaned close and spoke in perfect English. "You Americans," the colonel said lightly, "you are very fortunate. An ocean between you and all this unpleasantness." Callahan met his eyes. "Oceans have a way of shrinking," the colonel's smile widened. "Just a fraction. History will decide." By the spring of 1939, history was moving faster than any of them wanted. Callahan stood on a train platform as German troops rolled east, flags snapping in the wind. Each movement was justified by another diplomatic excuse, another signed paper, another promise made and broken before the ink dried. Poland loomed in every conversation, spoken in careful tones, like saying its name too loudly might make it disappear. He cabled Washington again and again. His warnings grew sharper. The replies grew quieter. When the invasion came, it came like a door kicked open in the dark. September 1st, dawn. Planes screamed overhead. Radios across Europe spat out the news in frantic bursts. Treaties crumbled in real time. Callahan listened from his office, the words Poland invaded echoing like a gunshot. He knew then, truly knew, that the world had tipped past the point of return. He packed a single suitcase. His orders were simple: evacuate, observe no more. As the embassy staff hurried through the corridors, Callahan paused at the map one last time. Someone had drawn a red arrow east in pencil. He didn't erase it. In America, the news landed like distant thunder. Michael Kowalski was drilling with his unit when the sergeant called them to attention and read the bulletin aloud. The men exchanged looks, uneasy, curious, excited in a way that frightened them. "Does this mean we're going in?" someone asked. The sergeant shook his head. "Means we're watching. Same as always." Michael wiped sweat from his brow and stared at the horizon. He thought of Anna, of their parents' stories, of a Europe that never seemed to stop bleeding. That night, Anna listened to the radio again, unable to turn it off this time. She imagined borders collapsing, families running, young men in uniforms that didn't yet belong to her brother. Across the country, factories hummed a little louder, newspapers sold a little faster, and in quiet rooms, men in Washington debated words like neutrality and interest, while the world burned one country at a time. Callahan's ship pulled away from the European coast, under a grey sky. He stood at the rail, coat collar turned up, watching the continent fade into fog. Somewhere behind him, the consequences of failed diplomacy were already marching. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a crumpled newspaper. The headline spoke of war in measured language, as if careful phrasing could contain it. Callahan closed his eyes, feeling the engine's vibration under his feet. He wasn't a soldier, not yet. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the choices made in rooms full of polished tables and cautious men would soon be paid for in blood. And when that bill came due, America would not stay on the sidelines forever. The ocean no longer felt wide enough. The Atlantic crossing gave Thomas Callahan too much time to think. The ship pitched through dark water, while newspapers piled up in the mess hall, each headline worse than the last. Denmark folded. Norway burned. France sat behind its concrete walls, telling itself stone could stop steel. Callahan read every column, tracing the arc of events he'd warned about, his stomach tightening with each confirmation that diplomacy, his diplomacy, had failed. When he stepped off the gangway in New York, the city felt louder than he remembered. Not panicked, not yet, just restless. Radios blared from storefronts, men argued on corners. The war felt like a story Americans were listening to from the safety of their living rooms, convinced it couldn't climb out of the speaker. Callahan reported to Washington within the week. He stood in a paneled office under portraits of stern men long dead, delivering his assessment to officials who nodded gravely but spoke in circles. "We must avoid entanglement," one senator said. "We can't ignore reality," another replied. Callahan wanted to shout that reality was already writing its own terms. Instead, he kept his voice level. "This war didn't start with tanks," he said. "It started with agreements that rewarded aggression. Every diplomatic maneuver Hitler made bought him time, resources, confidence. Now he doesn't need permission anymore." Silence followed. Pens scratched paper. No one argued. That worried him most. By 1940, the war reached into American homes whether people wanted it to or not. Michael Kowalski had traded weekend drills for full-time duty. The Guard became the Army. Training camps sprang up overnight, muddy and rushed, filled with men learning how to be soldiers because history had decided for them. Fort Dix smelled like oil, sweat, and wet canvas. Michael learned to march until his feet blistered, to strip a rifle blindfolded, to sleep through shouting. At night, he lay on his bunk, listening to distant laughter and quieter sobs, wondering how a kid from Scranton ended up preparing for a war an ocean away. One evening, while cleaning his weapon, he asked the man beside him, a farmhand from Iowa named Jack Turner, what he thought about it all. "You mean Hitler?" Jack said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Guy's been pushing his luck for years. World just kept stepping back." Michael nodded. "Feels like we're paying for someone else's bad decisions." Jack shrugged. "Aren't we always?" Anna wrote letters every week. She didn't know what to say anymore, so she talked about small things: the weather, a neighbor's new baby, a movie she'd seen alone because it felt wrong to enjoy it too much. She never mentioned her fear directly. It lived between the lines. Michael folded each letter carefully, keeping them in his footlocker. When he read them, the war felt farther away. When he finished, it felt closer than ever. In Europe, the cost of those early political missteps became impossible to ignore. Callahan was back overseas by 1941, this time as part of a military liaison mission to Britain. London was a city under siege, blackouts at night, rubble by morning, resolve stretched thin but unbroken. He walked streets still smoking from Luftwaffe raids, listening to British officers curse the years they'd spent believing Hitler could be reasoned with. "He showed us exactly who he was," a Royal Air Force captain said, bitterly over tea. "We just didn't want to listen." Callahan watched anti-aircraft crews work through the night, their faces illuminated by fire and exhaustion. Diplomacy felt like a luxury item now, something people reminisced about the way they did peace. During one briefing, news came in of another U-boat attack in the Atlantic. An American merchant ship had gone down. Survivors were few. Callahan stared at the map as red pins multiplied along shipping lanes. The ocean that once felt like a barrier now looked like a battleground, waiting for its first official shot. December 7th, 1941. Anna heard the announcement while standing in line at the butcher shop. The radio crackled, the words tumbling out fast and raw. Pearl Harbor attacked. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the room exploded with voices: shock, anger, disbelief. Someone dropped a bag. Someone else started crying. Anna didn't remember the walk home. She only remembered sitting at the kitchen table, hands clenched, knowing with a clarity that stole her breath that Michael was no longer training for a possibility. He was going to war. Michael heard the news on the parade ground. The order was barked, the flag raised, and suddenly every man stood a little straighter. Fear didn't disappear, but it found purpose. Jack leaned over. "Guess the ocean finally wasn't wide enough." Michael didn't answer. He thought of his sister. He thought of Callahan's kind of men. Men who'd tried to stop this with words and failed. Now it was up to rifles. Callahan listened to Roosevelt's speech from a crowded room in London. The declaration rolled through the air like thunder long overdue. Some men cheered. Others simply closed their eyes. Afterward, Callahan stepped outside. Searchlights cut white scars across the sky. Somewhere, bombs were falling. Somewhere else, American factories were already shifting gears. He realized then that the war had come full circle, from conference tables to trenches, from signatures to sacrifice, and as American ships steamed east and young men learned the weight of a helmet, the consequences of those early diplomatic gambles became flesh and blood. The war was no longer a distant tragedy. It was personal. The first American boots hit European soil under a sky the color of old bruises. Michael Kowalski stepped off the transport truck in North Africa, the heat slamming into him like a physical blow. It wasn't the Europe of his parents' stories, no green hills, no church bells. But it was the first place American blood would soak into foreign ground in this war. Sand crept into everything. Rifles, boots, mouths. It ground down patience fast. They called it Operation Torch. The name sounded clean, almost hopeful. Combat wasn't. The first shots came at dawn. French guns fired uncertainly from ridgelines, the crack of artillery echoing across the desert. Michael pressed himself into the sand as rounds snapped overhead, heart hammering so hard he thought it might split his ribs. "Move! Move!" the lieutenant shouted. Michael ran because the man next to him ran, because stopping felt worse than dying. Jack Turner was ahead of him, waving him forward, mouth open in a yell Michael couldn't hear over the chaos. This wasn't about Hitler's speeches or treaties signed years ago. This was dirt in his teeth, sweat in his eyes, the weight of a rifle suddenly too real. When it ended, when the smoke drifted away and the firing slowed, Michael realized his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He forced them still and looked around. Jack was sitting against a rock, breathing hard, laughing like a madman. "Well," Jack said hoarsely, "guess that settles the debate." Michael swallowed. "About what?" "About whether this was ever going to stay over there." Across the Atlantic, Thomas Callahan stood on a cliff overlooking the English Channel, watching ships gather like iron insects on the water. The invasion of Europe was coming. Everyone felt it. The briefings were blunt now, stripped of pretense. Callahan's role had changed. He wasn't advising diplomats anymore. He was translating the enemy, explaining how Hitler's early political victories had shaped the battlefield they were about to step onto. He exploited hesitation, Callahan told a room full of American and British officers. Every delay, every compromise, gave him terrain without firing a shot. What you're facing now is the compounded interest of appeasement. No one argued. They studied maps marked with red and blue arrows, calculating casualties before the first man ever stepped onto a beach. Afterward, a young captain approached him. "Sir, do you ever wonder if this could have been stopped?" Callahan didn't answer right away. He thought of Berlin, of torchlight parades, of cables unanswered. "Yes," he said quietly, "every night." The invasion of Italy cost Jack Turner his life. It happened fast, too fast for meaning to catch up. A mortar round landed short. Shrapnel tore through the air. Jack was laughing 1 second, face smeared with dirt, and the next he was on the ground, eyes wide, chest red and still. Michael dropped beside him, screaming for a medic who was already busy dying somewhere else. He pressed his hands to Jack's wound, feeling warmth seep through his fingers. "Hey," Jack whispered, breath bubbling. "Tell Iowa I tried." Michael choked out a laugh that sounded like a sob. "You'll tell him yourself." Jack's eyes drifted past him, unfocused. "Guess some deals ain't worth making." Then he was gone. Michael stayed there longer than he should have. He had to be dragged away, Jack's blood drying on his sleeves. That night, he wrote Anna a letter he never sent. There were no words that didn't feel like lies. By June of 1944, the war had narrowed to a single question. Could they break Hitler's hold on Europe before it bled itself dry? D-Day answered with fire. Michael hit the beach at Normandy under a sky ripped open by artillery. The ramp dropped, men fell, water churned red, orders dissolved into instinct. He ran, he fell, he crawled behind steel obstacles slick with blood. Somewhere, a man prayed loudly. Somewhere else a machine gun stitched the sand. Michael saw a medic trying to reach a wounded officer, saw him spin and collapse mid-step. The sight burned into him, a snapshot he knew would never leave. When they finally pushed inland, bodies littered the beach like discarded gear. Victory tasted like ash. Callahan landed 2 days later with follow-on units. He walked through shattered French villages, hearing whispers of gratitude and grief from civilians who'd survived under occupation. Old men shook his hand. Women cried. Children stared at his uniform like it was something out of legend. In one ruined town hall, Callahan found a wall covered in Nazi proclamations, orders posted years ago after diplomats had shaken hands and sworn peace. He tore one down and folded it carefully, like evidence. That night, he sat with a group of soldiers, sharing cigarettes. Someone asked him what Berlin had been like before the war. "Quiet," Callahan said. "Too quiet. Like everyone was waiting for permission to stop pretending." Michael listened from the edge of the group, Jack's absence a hollow weight beside him. "Did we wait too long?" Michael asked suddenly. Callahan met his eyes. The boy looked older now, hardened. "Yes," he said. "But you're here now. That counts for something." The push toward Germany was relentless. Town by town, forest by forest, each mile paid for twice, once by men with guns, once by men who'd once believed ink could stop iron. Michael survived a sniper's bullet by inches. He watched friends disappear in flashes of fire and screaming. He learned to stop asking why. Callahan crossed the Rhine with advance units, the river choked with wreckage and smoke. On the far bank lay the Reich, cracked, furious, but still dangerous. As artillery thundered in the distance, Callahan realized something with chilling clarity. The war hadn't just exposed Hitler's ambitions. It had exposed the cost of believing tyrants could be satisfied. The final reckoning was close now. And it would not be gentle. Germany in 1945 looked like the end of the world after the end of a bad dream. Michael Kowalski walked through streets that no longer had names, just piles of brick and twisted metal where lives had been folded inward by bombs and desperation. The air smelled of smoke, rot, and something heavier that no one talked about. Even victory felt cautious here, like the land itself might explode if you celebrated too loudly. Gunfire still cracked in the distance, isolated pockets of resistance, refusing to accept what everyone else already knew. It was over, or close enough to taste. Michael's unit cleared a small town outside Leipzig in early April. A white flag hung from a shattered window. An old man stood in the street with his hands raised, shaking so badly his knees knocked together. "Bitter," he kept saying. Michael didn't speak German, but he understood surrender when he saw it. He lowered his rifle slightly, gesturing the man toward the curb. For a moment, Michael felt something dangerous. Pity. Then he remembered Jack. Normandy. Italy. The beach red with blood. Pity didn't erase responsibility. War wasn't about monsters, he'd learned. It was about choices made years before by men who never heard the screaming. Thomas Callahan entered Berlin on a grey morning under a low, bruised sky. The city he'd once known, its cafes, its polished offices, its careful lies, was gone. In its place stood a corpse of stone and ash. He walked past the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, boots crunching on glass. The echo followed him, lonely and final. Soldiers moved cautiously, weapons ready, eyes tired beyond their years. In a half-collapsed building, Callahan found an abandoned office. Papers lay scattered across the floor, memoranda, speeches, diplomatic correspondence. He knelt and picked one up, brushing off dust. It was a copy of an early treaty. Promises, assurances, all the words that had once convinced the world to wait. Callahan folded the paper, and slipped it into his coat, not as a souvenir, as a warning. The shooting stopped in Michael's sector 2 days before the official surrender. When the order finally came down, it felt unreal, like someone had switched off a sound that had been constant for years. Some men cheered, some cried, some just sat down where they were and stared at nothing. Michael did none of it. He walked to the edge of town and sat alone, helmet beside him, staring at the horizon. The silence rang louder than artillery. That night, he wrote Anna. "It's over," he began. The words looked fragile on the page. "I don't know how to explain what that means. I'm coming home. I'm not the same. I hope that's okay." He folded the letter carefully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she'd read it. Callahan stood in a crowded room as news of Hitler's death spread. No cheers. Just a collective exhale, like the world releasing a breath it had been holding since Munich, since Poland, since the first time someone had convinced themselves compromise would be enough. A British officer muttered, "Funny thing, all that death, and it ends with a man alone in a bunker." Callahan thought of early receptions, of smiles and handshakes, of the way history had been nudged instead of confronted. "Not alone," Callahan said softly. Millions followed him there. Michael returned home in the fall. Scranton hadn't changed, or maybe it had, and he just couldn't see it the same way. Anna stood on the platform, thinner than he remembered, eyes searching faces until they locked onto his. She didn't run. Neither did he. They walked toward each other, slowly, like sudden movements might break something fragile. When she hugged him, he held on too tight, breathing her in, grounding himself in something real and living. "You're home," she whispered. "Yeah," he said. "I am." At night, the war came back in pieces, sounds, flashes, faces. Anna never asked him to explain. She just stayed. Callahan testified before a congressional committee months later. The room felt smaller than Berlin, but the stakes were just as heavy. "What lessons should we take from this war?" a senator asked. Callahan didn't hesitate. "That diplomacy without resolve is permission," he said. "That delaying confrontation doesn't prevent conflict. It reshapes it into something worse. And that the cost of political miscalculation is always paid by people who never had a vote." The room was silent. Outside, the American flag snapped in the wind. Years later, Michael would visit Jack Turner's grave in Iowa. He'd stand there, hands in his pockets, thinking about sand and snow and the strange way history tied men together. And Callahan would keep the folded treaty in his desk drawer, pulling it out whenever someone spoke too confidently about peace bought cheap. World War II didn't begin with a single gunshot. It began with meetings, with misjudgments, with the belief that evil could be bargained with, and it ended with survivors carrying memories heavy enough to last a lifetime, proof that words matter, choices matter, and that the silence after war is never truly quiet. It listens, waiting,